As Chinese medical theory becomes more detailed, one of the first major structures introduced is the system known as Zang-Fu. These terms are often translated as organs, but this translation is misleading and can cause confusion if taken literally. Zang-Fu do not refer to anatomical objects in the same way organs are understood in modern biomedical models. Instead, they describe functional networks, each responsible for coordinating specific patterns of activity within the body. These networks include physical structures, but they are not limited to them. They also encompass processes, tendencies, relationships, and modes of regulation that unfold over time. In this framework, an organ is not defined by what it looks like, but by what it does and how it interacts with other functions. This distinction is essential because attempting to map Zang-Fu directly onto anatomical organs leads to misunderstanding and contradiction. Classical Chinese medicine was not developed through dissection or microscopic analysis. It was developed through long-term observation of patterns in health, illness, behavior, and response to change. As a result, Zang-Fu are organized around observable function rather than structural detail. Each Zang or Fu represents a stable pattern of physiological activity that can be recognized through its effects rather than its form. Some of these patterns are more inward, stabilizing, and conserving in nature. Others are more outward, transformative, and responsive. This difference in function is reflected in the distinction between Zang and Fu themselves. Zang are associated with storage, regulation, and maintenance of internal balance. Fu are associated with transformation, movement, and the processing of input and output. These categories are not rigid compartments, but relational tendencies that describe how activity is organized. No Zang or Fu functions independently. Each exists in constant relationship with others, exchanging influence and adjusting according to circumstance. Because of this, Zang-Fu are best understood as dynamic networks rather than isolated units. Their boundaries are defined by function and interaction, not by physical separation. This functional approach allows Chinese medicine to describe complex physiological behavior without reducing the body to mechanical parts. It also allows the same system to be observed at different levels, from gross physical function to subtle regulatory change. Before assigning names, correspondences, or detailed functions, it is important to recognize that Zang-Fu represent patterns of organization rather than objects. They are tools for observing how the body maintains coherence amid constant change. With this understanding in place, the Zang-Fu system can be explored in detail without being mistaken for a simplified anatomy. This sets the foundation for understanding how yin and yang, the 5 phases, and physiological function come together within the living system. Within the Zang-Fu system, yin and yang are used to describe how different functional networks organize activity rather than to label fixed structures. The distinction between Zang and Fu reflects a fundamental difference in how physiological processes are oriented and regulated. Zang systems are generally associated with yin qualities, not because they are passive or inert, but because their primary role involves storage, regulation, and internal stability. These functions require continuity over time rather than rapid transformation. Fu systems, by contrast, are generally associated with yang qualities because their primary role involves movement, processing, and transformation of input and output. These activities are dynamic, responsive, and outwardly engaged with change. This yin-yang distinction does not imply that Zang are inactive or that Fu lack stability. Both contain yin and yang aspects within their function. The distinction reflects orientation rather than absolute qualities. Zang functions tend to preserve and maintain internal coherence. Fu functions tend to facilitate exchange, circulation, and movement through the system. These orientations allow activity to be distributed efficiently without exhausting internal reserves. Yin and Yang within Zang-Fu therefore describe how physiological work is divided and coordinated rather than where it is physically located. A Zang network may engage in dynamic activity while still serving a stabilizing role. A Fu network may support continuity while remaining primarily transformative. This relational use of yin and yang prevents the system from becoming rigid or oversimplified. Rather than assigning fixed qualities to organs, the model emphasizes how functions balance one another through complementary roles. Zang and Fu are always understood in relation, not isolation. Transformation requires storage. Movement requires regulation. By observing how yin-oriented and yang-oriented functions interact, the system remains adaptable to changing demands. This approach allows physiological balance to be understood as coordinated activity rather than static equilibrium. Importantly, yin and yang assignments within Zang-Fu are always contextual. They shift according to time, condition, and overall pattern rather than remaining fixed labels. Understanding this prevents later confusion when functions appear to change role under different circumstances. It also reinforces the idea that yin and yang describe relationship and direction, not permanent identity. With this framework in place, individual Zang and Fu networks can be explored without losing sight of their functional orientation. This prepares the ground for examining specific systems while preserving a unified view of physiological organization. The distinction between Zang and Fu becomes clearer when their functions are examined through the lens of time rather than structure. Zang networks are responsible for maintaining continuity across longer periods, preserving resources, and regulating internal conditions so that activity can be sustained. Storage, in this sense, does not mean accumulation for its own sake. It refers to the ability to hold, regulate, and make available what is needed over time without depletion. These functions require stability, coordination, and resistance to rapid fluctuation. Because of this, Zang activity is oriented toward long-term balance rather than immediate response. Fu networks, by contrast, are oriented toward transformation that occurs in the present moment. They process input, facilitate movement, and respond to changing conditions through active exchange. This transformation allows material, information, and influence to circulate through the system rather than stagnate. Fu functions are therefore time-sensitive, responding quickly to demand and releasing what is no longer needed. Together, storage and transformation form a complementary relationship. Without storage, transformation would quickly exhaust available resources. Without transformation, storage would become stagnant and unusable. The distinction between Zang and Fu does not describe separate compartments, but coordinated roles within a single system. Each relies on the other to maintain functional continuity. Zang provide the conditions that allow Fu to act without destabilizing the system. Fu provide the movement that prevents Zang functions from becoming static or overloaded. This balance allows the body to meet immediate demands while preserving long-term stability. When this coordination is lost, imbalance may appear either as depletion through excessive transformation or stagnation through insufficient movement. Understanding Zang and Fu in terms of time and function rather than location prevents them from being mistaken for anatomical parts. It also explains why the same structure may appear involved in multiple functions across different contexts. This perspective allows physiological activity to be understood as coordinated work distributed across networks rather than isolated actions. By focusing on storage and transformation as complementary processes, the Zang-Fu system remains coherent, adaptable, and responsive to changing conditions. Within the Zang-Fu system, no functional network can be understood in isolation because physiological activity emerges through relationship rather than independent action. Each Zang or Fu operates within a web of interaction, continuously influencing and being influenced by other systems. This interdependence reflects the same relational logic established earlier through yin and yang and the five phases. Rather than acting as isolated units, Zang and Fu function as coordinated partners within larger patterns of regulation and movement. Some relationships are closer and more immediate, involving direct coordination between specific networks. Others are more diffuse, involving indirect influence across multiple systems over time. These relationships allow function to be distributed efficiently, preventing overload or exhaustion within any single network. When one system becomes strained, others adjust to compensate, maintaining overall coherence. This adaptability depends on communication and responsiveness rather than fixed hierarchy. Because of this, dysfunction rarely arises from a single Zang or Fu acting alone. It emerges when relationships between systems become misaligned, excessive, or insufficient. Understanding this prevents the mistake of attributing complex patterns to isolated causes. Instead, attention is directed toward how coordination, support, and regulation are unfolding across networks. Functional pairing plays an important role in this organization, allowing yin-oriented and yang-oriented processes to remain balanced. These pairings are not rigid assignments, but relational tendencies that shift with context and demand. By examining Zang-Fu through their relationships, the system remains flexible and capable of describing complex physiological behavior. This approach also explains why symptoms may appear distant from their underlying functional source. Changes in one network may express themselves through another that is more immediately responsive or exposed. Recognizing this relational structure allows patterns to be understood without oversimplification. It also reinforces the idea that balance is maintained through coordination rather than control. By viewing Zang-Fu as interdependent networks, Chinese medicine preserves a holistic understanding without abandoning functional clarity. This sets the stage for exploring specific pairings and relationships in greater detail while maintaining coherence across the system. Confusion often arises when concepts from Chinese medicine are compared directly to Western anatomical models without recognizing that they describe different kinds of knowledge. Western anatomy is primarily concerned with physical structure, location, and material composition. Its strength lies in precise visualization, measurement, and mechanical description. Chinese medicine, by contrast, developed as a system for observing function, regulation, and change over time. Rather than asking where something is located, it asks how activity is coordinated and maintained. Because of this difference in emphasis, the same term may appear to refer to similar things while actually describing different levels of organization. For example, an anatomical organ may overlap with a Zang or Fu network, but it does not define it. The Zang-Fu system includes physical structures, but it also includes patterns of regulation, responsiveness, and interaction that extend beyond any single anatomical site. When Western anatomical expectations are imposed onto Chinese medical terms, the result is often contradiction or oversimplification. This leads to the mistaken belief that one system is imprecise or symbolic, while the other is objective and concrete. In reality, each system answers different questions using different methods of observation. Western anatomy excels at describing what is present. Chinese medicine excels at describing how activity unfolds, adjusts, and maintains coherence. Neither perspective replaces the other. They operate at different levels and serve different purposes. Understanding this distinction allows both systems to be held simultaneously without forcing false equivalence. It also prevents frustration when direct translation fails or when mappings appear inconsistent. By recognizing that Zang-Fu describe functional organization rather than material form, their logic becomes internally consistent and practically useful. This clarity allows Chinese medical theory to be studied on its own terms without requiring validation through anatomical correspondence. At the same time, it allows modern learners to appreciate how different models can coexist without contradiction. Holding this distinction is essential for developing real understanding rather than surface comparison. With this perspective in place, the Zang-Fu system can be explored in detail without confusion, reduction, or unnecessary conflict.